So this morning, we're really happy to have Dan Noble with us, who I'll introduce in a minute. But I did say at the beginning of my talk that we would go to an interactive forum, and then I promptly lied to you. So if anybody who knows John and I know that if you ever get us together, you will never get a word in edgewise. So promise there will be some questions after Dan's talk, and then we will go into our first forum where people are interacting, and then hopefully we can interact with you. So right now, what I'd like to do is introduce Dan Noble. Dan made the treacherous drive over this morning, braving elements and high winds, know the usual Wyoming stuff. Actually, the high winds are why we're here. Dan is the director of the Department of Revenue. He's appointed by the governor in 2013. You can read his bio. He's a U.S. Army veteran. He's served for 7 years in the Army. He's kind of the go-to person in the state when you want to talk about taxation and revenue. I've been really lucky to be involved with Dan occasionally when there are tax forums in the state. A few years ago, I was asked to moderate a panel on taxation. I'll be honest with you, I'm an economist, which means that I pretend I know things about other things, but it's really lucky that we have people like Dan here who really do know everything, or many things, about really important topics like revenue. And one of the major issues, obviously, that we have to talk about is the state revenue situation. And one of the opportunities we have is to see how wind energy could fit into that puzzle. So what I will do is call Dan up. Come on up. Please welcome Dan Noble from the Department of Revenue. Thank you.
We're going to figure it out.
Morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Rob for inviting me to be part of this forum. It is an extremely important topic for the state of Wyoming, and obviously for the revenue picture of Wyoming. When I was asked to do this, I started thinking about wind energy, and I thought about a number of years ago when I had just gotten out of the military and working in a grocery store in Riverton, Wyoming, and I had an opportunity to drive from Casper the back way to Laramie, and I was driving through Medicine Bow, and I saw this huge structure being built at the time, and it looked like a weather vane. I had no idea what it actually was at the time, but it was pretty amazing to see actually what it was. Back in 1982, and I thank Professor Naughton for stealing some of my thunder here. Wyoming dedicated 2 wind turbines in Medicine Bow. And one was a 4 megawatt wind turbine, the other was a 2.5 megawatt wind turbine. At the time, the 4 megawatt turbine was the most powerful in the world, and it remained so for 20 years, surprisingly. There was an issue with both of these turbines. They were probably built before their time. The one turbine, right there, actually only operated for 18 months. And then the main bearing failed on it, and it ended up being sold for scrap for $20,000. This is a $6 million project at the time, so you can imagine that's a pretty tough deal to have to eat that. The second turbine survived until 1986. When it failed, it was repaired, operated again, and then a windstorm, surprisingly enough, took it out in 1994. So it didn't survive too awful long either. But I think what's important to recognize is that we were involved in this energy project early on, and I think that some of the things that were discovered, not only in Wyoming, but where these projects were sprung up across the country, really played an important role in where we are today. I mean, Professor Naughton showed you some pictures of turbines now that probably dwarf these things. However, that was a very large turbine at its time, and it's amazing how far this technology and this industry has come. But it really called me here to talk today about taxes. And I think what I would like to do is talk about the existing tax structure for the state of Wyoming as it relates to each of the main tax types and how it impacts wind energy. Sales tax is one of the major revenue sources for the state of Wyoming. It is imposed on retail sales of tangible personal property in the state, and we tax most everything. There are exemptions, and one of those exemptions was passed in 2003 by the legislature. It's House Bill 188, and it exempted equipment used in generation electricity from renewable resources. So it wasn't just wind turbines, it was anything that would be used to generate electricity from a renewable source. Solar, obviously, was another one of these. But the main driver for this exemption and the reasons for it passage at the time was some efforts by the industry, the wind industry, to provide an economic incentive to put these turbines in Wyoming. There had already, in 1999, I believe Foot Creek was where the first turbines appeared in the state on a commercial basis, and small turbines. During the session that I was involved in, I believe it was some folks from Uinta County that were going to be placing turbines there were the ones that actually came and asked for the exemption, and it was granted in 2003. In 2010, the legislature passed the wind energy tax, if you will. It was a 2010 session, and it created a tax on electricity generated from wind resources. It was set up so that during the first 3 years of a facility's production, they were exempt from this tax, and then they began paying a tax in year 4, if you will, after production begins at $1 per megawatt hour produced. That tax is shared between state and local government, and I'll show how that's distributed in a minute or two. On December 31st of 2011, the exemption that was put in place for equipment sold from renewable resources actually sunsetted, and the tax is now imposed, the sales tax is now imposed on the equipment used by wind generation. Property tax is also imposed at the county level on generation facilities. It is considered industrial property, taxed based on its fair market value at an assessment ratio of 11.5%, and that is then multiplied by the revenues that are assessed in that particular county. 43 mills associated with that tax is associated with the funding of schools in the state. And important to recognize that a very large portion of these taxes go to actually fund education in the state. This is the assessed value that has been reported in the last 5 years by the producers of electricity by renewable resources in Wyoming. As you can see, the assessed value doesn't look all that high right now. And one of the reasons that I can say for that is because of the fact that some of these properties are approaching their lifespan. The properties that were built in 1999 probably are almost fully depreciated, so you're not going to see a huge amount of value with those. The newer projects will obviously create an awful lot more tax revenue, but in the last 5 years, you're looking at about $1.4 million to $1.2 million a year in tax from property taxes from the generation folks. The assessed value is reported by the facilities because those values, the assessed value is actually used to distribute the taxes in the state. As I mentioned, in 2010 session, we began imposing the tax on, the generation tax on electricity produced by wind energy. $1 per megawatt hour, and the tax is basically 40% goes to the state's general fund, and 60% goes to counties where the production is generated. That allocation of the assessed value is reported to us so that we know which county receives the taxes, and it's based on their proportionate share of the total assessed value in the state. So that, you know, if Carbon County gets whatever its assessed value is versus the entire state's valuation. And I mentioned before, the generation tax is not taxed during the first 3 years. This is what has been reported in the last 4 years, that there's actually been production reported because of the exemptions that were out there. Roughly anywhere between $3.7 and $4 million a year, 4.4 in 1 year. As I understand it, what is going to create some of the fluctuations in this is taking things offline for maintenance, the capacity factors. The wind obviously is an issue in these areas. How much is actually produced? A lot of different factors can replace or can create fluctuations in this tax. It is something that will not be totally stable. As things come on and go offline, it will either increase or decrease, but at this point it's been fairly stable between $3.7 and $4.4 million a year. I think one of the things that's been very critical as to how this tax evolved. When the exemption from sales tax on generation equipment was passed in 2003, I don't think people understood what impact it might have on things on the tax policy for the state. And one of the things that folks began noticing was the impact assistance payments, which is something that associated with large industrial projects like these that is paid out to the counties based on the impacts that are generated from the project itself. The state recognized that there are certain things that the county has to do in order to be able to accommodate this influx of large production facilities and the contractors that come in to build them and things like that. So what they've done is they created an impact assistance payment from the sales tax generated over and above what they would normally expect to see. The way to create that is that you actually look at the base period amount, the 12 months prior to the project starting. You look at the sales tax that was generated in that county for the 12 months prior to that project coming in, and then you look at the period during construction to see how much more that would increase. The state takes that difference and it pays it out to the affected areas based on a formula that's created by the Industrial Siting Council. Well, that's great when there's tax generated over and above the base period amount. But if what you're building is exempt from tax, there is very little, if any, increase from the base period amount. And that was something that became evident, and it became a major discussion in the Revenue Committee and in a number of counties where these projects were going in. I was concerned about it. Well, how are we going to fund these impacts if we're not going to receive it from the impact assistance funding? That was one of the issues that was generated, and they were trying to figure out a way to say, okay, how do we mitigate these impacts with the sales tax dollars when there's none being generated? And that was a major factor in what ultimately happened when they first sunsetted the exemption on this tax, and ultimately ended up removing it entirely. Is it the only reason? No, there were a huge number of discussions held on this issue. There were discussions held on the actual, I guess I'd call it, for lack of a better term, what the impact on the Wyoming economy was of wind energy. There was concerns about that because obviously at that point in time it was felt they're competing directly against coal. They're heavily subsidized, and there was a big concern raised by that. Okay, what exactly do we do to mitigate these costs? A study was funded by the legislature to look at what the state could do as it relates to evolving tax policy for the wind industry. They created a model, they contracted with a company to create a model to look at what the structure of the wind industry looks like as far as its financial structure. The economic structure was comprised of obviously their costs, some of the subsidies that were associated with it, and where they could sell it, what the actual prices that they could demand for this was, and when you looked at it, it was referred to as the E3 model. At the time, it was very heavily debated, but whether it really returned what the actual impact was on the industry at the time. There was an awful lot of discussion held over it, and really, I can't say that it actually spawned the idea of the generation tax or not, but it actually is suspicious that the timing happened almost immediately after that. It had been considered for a long time. As a matter of fact, the scenarios that were being looked at when they ran these models, some of them included a generation tax or something like it. And it was being contemplated at the time to look at that. The generation tax ultimately ended up being passed not long after this model was run. It was run and it was passed during the legislative session with an idea that the $1 per megawatt hour was considered a placeholder. And that's where I think we're going to have issues as it relates to tax policy in the future. We don't actually know where that placeholder will end up. But I do want to explain something else. This is not contemplated just in 2010 or even before that. It was actually during the Tax Reform 2000 committee meetings that were held. There was a discussion even back then associated with a generation tax. Now, it was a generation tax on the production of all electricity at that point in time. It was not strictly on wind energy, but it was discussed. It was not taken forward as a recommendation at the time, but it is something that was discussed by the legislature even back then. One of the issues raised was that at the time, I think they said 75% of Wyoming's power actually leaves the state, and they felt like there was need to actually gain some value as it relates to the generation of that electricity. I do remember that it was probably just a few days after it became known that Wyoming imposed a generation tax that we actually made national news on Hannity. He said that Wyoming is now the first state to tax the wind. And it was not said in a very kind fashion, I can tell you that. He was not very impressed at all. We are not the only state to tax a generation. I believe that the state of Minnesota does in certain areas as well, but it is not anywhere near the extent that we do. The generation tax itself and how it evolves I think is really up to speculation. I think one thing we want to do is look at what exactly would happen under the current structure in the future. I know there are an awful lot of projects being contemplated, but the one that I've seen the most discussion about in the papers has been the Sierra Madre chokecherry plant. It is moving forward. It has been. I saw the EIS for it, and I have looked at it. Obviously, I've been in the newspapers as well. That one project with 1,000 turbines being created, and I'm just using it as an example, would generate $232 million for the state of Wyoming in sales tax alone. And that's over, I believe, an 8-year construction period. The generation tax would generate roughly $10.5 million a year in taxation. So it would triple what we're currently getting and then some. It's amazing. Property taxes, and this is from their sources, and one of the things that's interesting about this, when you look at property taxes, there are a lot of things that play into how these taxes get assessed. There is such a thing as obsolescence that can be deducted from some of this, and if these things as they're built, become obsolete during that time frame. It will accelerate, if you will, the depreciation itself and its value. But estimated by the company at this point, over a 20-year period, is $377 million in property taxes. Not an insignificant amount of money over the 20 years of its life. And that assumes that the structure, the tax policy structure as it relates to the taxation of this energy source remains intact as it is today. I put 3 question marks here because when you look at the prospective tax structure, it's going to be very difficult to ascertain. I've been involved in the Revenue Committee for a lot of years, and as everyone in this room knows, Wyoming is suffering from a very difficult economic downturn from the energy sectors. Not only from them themselves, but quite frankly from sales tax as well. We've lost a huge amount of revenue over the last three years, and there's not really a recovery that puts us back where we were in 2014. I don't see it. I'm involved in the Craig Committee, and we're looking at this being fairly stable where it's at right now, which still is a tough area for the state. The discussions held in the Revenue Committee have been associated with looking for various revenue enhancements as well as trying to define areas where we can actually save revenue as well, or cut on expenses as well. There has been a discussion associated with the gross receipts tax that would impact this industry. Okay. There have been issues associated with taxing services, and quite frankly, there's a sales tax on the generation of electricity as it stands right now. So I don't know that would impact it significantly, but I mean, when you consider some of the other things, like the construction workers and people like that build these things, there could be an impact on the actual construction of these projects as well. There has been discussion associated with raising the generation tax. And really, one of the things that I think, in all fairness to the folks that are looking at this, one of the reasons for considering that is a way to mitigate the costs associated with viewshed, the things that are whether you like the look of these things or not. I mean, I've become somewhat accustomed to it because they're right outside of Cheyenne, so I see them all the time. But it's something that you're seeing more and more across the entire country. I traveled to Northern Ireland here a couple of years ago, and along the coastline there were wind turbines everywhere. And I like to think that the wind there was what affected my golf game. It was quite terrible, actually. But I had a great time golfing there anyway. But it's I think it's a reality. When they mentioned that the wind is here to stay, that wind energy is here to stay, I think that's probably safe to say. Is it something that tax policy is going to have an impact on? I think it already does to some extent. To what extent? That is really up to anyone to decide at this point. I think there's been a lot of study done associated with it and what it will actually look like for the state. But I think it's only safe to say that tax will play a role in this, and it's something that really needs to be considered carefully as we move forward. With that, I will stand for the questions you have, and I want to thank Rob again for inviting me. This was it's been interesting. I wish I could stick around for the whole session, but I'm now going from here to Jackson, so it's going to be kind of a whirlwind trip. But I do appreciate you folks having me, and I'll stand for any questions you may have associated with this. And I think Rob also has them as well. Yes, ma'am.
What's the tax policy in the other states, like Northwest Texas or some of the other states?
I can't speak specifically about states, but there are.
She was asking what the tax policy is in other states.
It's my understanding that there are exemptions in place for a lot of the equipment that is being put in place, not universally, but there are exemptions in some states. And one of the things that's really difficult to get your handle around with any of these tax policy issues is because different states have different tax policies. In the state of Texas, that you mentioned, it's pretty hard to compare because of the fact that they have a gross receipts tax in Texas. It's referred to as a franchise tax, but it's actually a tax on their gross receipts. I do not know what level it's taxed at, but it is a tax that is very different than Wyoming's. And I would assume that the industry folks that probably do anything in that state could probably provide you with an awful lot more information on those specific states. But comparing apples to apples is very difficult because tax policy across the different states is going to vary with not only rates, but different tax types as well. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't really understand why local tax revenue was higher for wind through the state. Can you explain that?
Let me qualify. Are you talking about the generation tax itself? When the bill was passed associated with, one of the concerns was, okay, the counties are the ones that are impacted by having the turbines constructed in their area, and I think that the issue was that they should benefit from having them there. The state needed a piece of that as well, obviously, but they actually, and that's just the way that when the bill was constructed, they felt that the county should have a higher percentage of the revenues that were being generated. And it is, this is not something that every county gets to enjoy. This is actually the counties that actually have assessed or actually have capacity in their county are the ones that benefit from this tax, and then the state obviously receives 40% into its general fund for that as well. Yes?
Is the Department of Revenue looking into maximizing our number 2 industry, tourism, and seeing how we can develop that in a greater capacity?
Actually, the Revenue Committee has been looking at developing a statewide tax system of some sort that would actually create I'm not going to call it an enterprise fund, but it would actually remove the Department of Tourism, which is a state agency, from the general fund and actually fund it through that tax, if you will. That accomplishes 2 things. First of all, it takes it off of the state's general fund expenses, and it also targets it based on the industries that actually benefits from its actions. So yes, there have been some moves made by the legislature. I don't develop that type of policy, but I certainly answer questions associated with it. So we've been working with the legislature to kind of look at how that would look if that tax were to be created. Any more? I think Rob wants to answer some of your questions as well here, so I'll pass it off to him. Thank you very much for having me, folks.
Thank you, Dan, for helping us with that. Great questions. If you do have other questions,